I move over to my topic, and I will try to use the historic document. Well, I would like to trace the phenomena of populism. And first of all, it is interpreted in a very blurred manner, a very broad manner, so much that it becomes unclear what they mean by this. And as the electorate think it's wrong, it's bad. But what about democracy? We don't care for democracy, they say. Democracy that brings Trump, democracy that allows the win of liberalism. We must go back. We must move away from the suffrage because it gives them losers to elect those who we would like to make it, boil it down to those elect, let them vote. Well, that's why the poor analysis of, because they understand that this is something that belongs to the period phenomena. There is this event, if you want to understand why magnet attracts iron, it's not necessary to assess only the plus or the minus only. They work in a pair, like together. And if you're saying that you speak about the reds, then please immediately reach the whites, because this is something that are relative. If they were not for the reds, there would be no whites. And these words appear together, and they go together. And in populism, there is another, the reverse side. It is related. Populism is always related to elitism. And not because any populism, at all times, as they describe their doctrine, always appeal to certain elite. Trump, a billionaire, goes out for his inauguration among the fact that I've come to give the people a chance to get rid of elites. He, a billionaire, mind you, seeks to give an opportunity to the people to do without this elite. Le Pen today claims that I'm a candidate of the people and I fight against elites. But the thing is that elitism is a necessary prerequisite for populism. And this is where I think I will move over to my hypothesis. I suppose that the Reds, the Bolsheviks in 1917 and then during the Civil War, embodied populism, left populism, whereas liberals and cadets, again, I will put it out, whom we conventionally have agreed to think they're liberals, we would not necessarily treat them as liberals now. They give an example of elitism. Now, so much what populism stands for. Populism, as I think it, is a hypocritical, this is most important, hypocritical playing down to the people that seeks to exploit its patterns, stereotypes, fears, and phobias. It ends at all times with, certainly, with deception. We don't know what Trump's rule will end in, but we know that populism brought him to power, and all the everything was there in his election campaign, which boiled down to one thing, that he was meant to fight. He thought that fighting the enemies in all that campaign, strictly speaking, the second candidate, however, became as much a populist like him. So, an elitism, inadequate perception of the masses. It may be very radical, anything from hatred towards people, saying cattle, wild gathering of drunkards, you're good only to distinguish. Nekrasov put it there, till misunderstanding and lack of understanding of what the masses think. Now, I will say this was born as out of discussion in my presentation. You can actually read my report and the discussions of those present, that Ayn Satarov and Yadragunsky, it's all posted on the site Liberal Mission Study. So I'll tell you, cadets were all for the statehood, and at that time imperial proponents who wanted to expand the borders. Modern viewpoint is that most liberals would rather treat them as non-handshakable, because not only were they in for saying that the Crimea's ours, but also Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, and others. At the end, I will say that the gun, of this imperial gun, it will give a shoot. I will tell you, but I then discuss the second group. I'll say that my presentation cannot be beige, not because I'm against beige. It's built in like contrast, red and whites, and my pictures also are in these red and white pictures. Strictly speaking, I sought to find them following this principle of red and white. And so going back to where we started. So we have people who are all for the empire, all proponents of the great power nationalists. This is the time between February and October. They started Lenin's book, The State in Revolution, was published, that reduced to absurdity, ad absurdum, Marx's idea that the state would disappear. Because what followed were things that Marx never meant to put there, like the full need to stop, to sort of do without officialdom and replace them with the so-called Soviets. So I'm introducing two more notions apart from populists and elitists. They are utopianists and realists. I'll show you how these notions changed, how they were used, and how you can use them to describe the behavior of two active persons. So, the Bolsheviks. Well, are utopian in strategy, but very realistic about tactics, sorry. Dying off of the state, one of the main utopias of the Bolshevik Revolution, and ideology. But if an utopia such as the world revolution has stayed put for several decades, and only in the 1970s the political bureau said no to this ideology and has sort of renounced this, then the gradual dying off of the state has immediately proven its utopian character. Bonch-Brujevich, one of the members of the Politburo of the Bolshevik Party, chairman of the so a little bit was the head of administration, let me put it this way, in the Council of People's Commissars, wrote, in several months' time of the new life, since in Petrograd, Moscow, and then all the cities, towns, and villages of the huge Russia were packed with new officials. In 1913, then employed 273,000, then 5.5 million in 1918. Then so it was 22 times more immediately, all of a sudden. Secondly, almost immediately, you would see that the Soviets that were supposed to replace the state turned out to be something very decorative and had no impact on the statehood. In this sense, strategic utopianism on the spectrum was something that became immediately clear. But since they were utopian about strategy, they turned to be very much effective in pragmatical and practical about their tactical actions. And in 1917, in February 1917, the Bolsheviks were the weakest of the political forces in the landscape of the Russian Empire. In every organ that would be elected, in every Soviet, they were the minority, absolute minority everywhere. And step by step, including with the participation using the misses and the mistakes committed by the opposite side, they strengthened their position first in Soviets, then in the Baltic Fleet, then they seized power in Petrograd, and these Soviets were actually blocking the activity of the provisional government. They created a certain effect of dual power, and they paralyzed what the provisional government do. So they paralyzed. They came up with this idea of diarchy. So they were again utopian about strategy and very much down-to-earth realists in practice. Again, the Cadets, constitutional Democrats, removed all limitations on they gave suffrage to women. Women's suffrage was won in Russia in 1917, 1 year before Germany, and Britain 2 years before the Netherlands, 50 years, more than 50 years sooner than Switzerland. So the initiatives were very much in line with the democratic trends present in the world. In many ways, as I put it, they laid foundation for that. They announced an amnesty, pronounced the main liberties. How many, which portion of the population, you suppose, at that time was very much interested with this value of liberty, of freedom, to much less degree, unmeasurable less? Then it's quite clear that one of the most important value was down with the war, land to the peasants, and let's have the Constitutional Assembly. And not one single out of these promises, out of these mottos of the Constitutional Democrats didn't implement that in the beginning. First and foremost, they allowed this diarchy, and on the ongoing basis, every week, then month by month, they would lose out to the government. They would be postponing and postponing the calling of the Constitutional Assembly, meeting, and again, they keep saying that the Bolsheviks were in the minority, but the Constitutional Democrats had less than 5% of votes. It means even fewer votes. It's hard to say what would have happened if they had taken the Constitutional Assembly, as was then required by all the political forces, if they had done it sooner, like in spring or autumn. But surely, if they had done it before, the October coup d'etat would not have happened, for the very simple reason that Petrograd Soviet at the time was chaired by Menshevik Chidze, who supported the government. He was often invited to take part in the provisional government just because he wanted to make sure that he would criticize the government because of the unpopular reform. It means no support by the Petrograd Council, that again became the source of the coup d'etat, was not found at the time. Those 40,000 guns were not there. The Red Guards that began in June after Kerensky armed the Bolsheviks against Kornilov. The situation in this particular case seems pretty obvious to me. So the second reason for success, a war. The cadets on the 6th of March announced that the country would continue in the war till the victorious end and will fulfill all international commitments. That's all correct, all right. In terms of rules for international behavior, it's known that the February Revolution, it became clear that on the 23rd of February, the demonstration by women, down with the war, bring back our husbands, give us bread. So it was the harbinger of the revolution to come. So that in those conditions, to stop the war was something that should be very imperative. So now, so much for the outcomes. About the populism in action. The fruits of populism and elitism, that's the name of my slide. And it represents a situation of grandiose deception of the masses that happened under the mottos, "Do let us stop the war," that was picked up by the Bolsheviks almost immediately. World War I continued for three and a half years, whereas the Civil War lasted 6 years. Demographic losses in the first case were, there are all kinds of estimates, but the most, how shall I put it, The top is 5,975,000 people, including 3 million prisoners, missing and those who deserted. So it's not so much those who were like irretrievably, who died, those who would become prisoners and but as to the civil war, that there are no disputes about this, who unleashed this war, because those who, as they actually ousted the Constitutional Assembly, then the Brest Peace, so there are no questions about. So the civil war led to losses of 25 million people due to epidemics, immigration, falling birth rate, and other direct demographic losses. Think of it, 25 million immediately. What about elitism? What did it lead to? Well, it just came out in the complete misunderstanding of what the masses wanted, because supporting the motto, war till the victory, was absolutely unrealistic in mid-1917. The army was going through this complete degradation. 50,000 Soviets existed in the army and in the fleet. They basically paralyzed what the army command wanted, and it was impossible to wage war under these circumstances. Further on, there was a failed assault in the spring of 1917 that made even more people desert. As of summer, they started to divide the landlords' lands, and this is something that immediately drove the peasants so that they should be in time to take share in this land. And at that time, there was 1.5 million. And finally, the failure of the rebellion, that the army was completely beheaded. In July, all the supreme, like the commander-in-chief Kornilov, Denikin, all those commanders of the army in this were imprisoned. They were arrested. They could not do. So to continue war under these circumstances would be absolutely impossible. And finally, the most important topic of my presentation that has always been of such interest in my specialty, this national ethnic issue. Well, I've been saying that the constitutional Democrats were all for imperial ideology. I made your attention that it was 1917, but all European democracies were also imperial. Were empires at the time. They were democracy for oneself and empires for their own colonies. So I would rather put it this way, that was very much the rule, not an exception. But 1914 led to the collapse of the empires. The Ottoman Empire collapsed like in dust. Austro-Hungarian was also collapsing. Chunk by chunk, they bit out the pieces of the German Empire. And the Russian Empire at that time showed independence was gained by Poland, Finland, as well as Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, independent Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so on and so on.
Under these conditions, it was virtually impossible to continue to adhere to the slogan of the single and undivided Russia. So another word about populism and elitism. In the national issues, the Bolsheviks showed how unprincipled they were, because the flurry of slogans in the national politics was just beyond belief. The idea of federation and the idea of cultural autonomy was coming from the Bund. But in 1917, in the process of gaining more and more popular support, the Bolsheviks, Ulyanov and Djugashvili, as he was responsible for the national question, they elaborated a new program which allowed them to gain more popular support within the National Republic. Iosif Djugashvili worked out a program for not only the respect for the national minorities, but also for the fact that the main task of the Bolsheviks in the national issues is the protection of the previously suppressed minor nations, whose main enemy is the Russian chauvinism. In 1920, we are seeing the very first signs of deportations of the so-called repressed nations. And then in 1937, 1941, over 2.6 million people were deported from the representatives of the national republics. At that time, there were not a single case, not a single example as to such huge masses of people to be relocated. And indeed, who are the Bolsheviks, populists or elitists? And on this example, we see that these are very mobile concepts. There were populists at the time when they had to snatch power, but once they arrived in power, there was no populism. They literally was an authoritarian, totalitarian elitism. And this is something which is indeed generally indicative of populism. The current Russian establishment is populist at the election time, one may argue. But after the elections, there is not much populist sentiment. More than that, there is this dual nature of such, and we can see on the one side populism, and on the other side, you take care, and it's a wonderful combination of two concepts in one flask, as they say. Elitism. Well, I think that elitism, there's hardly more vivid example of full negligence with respect to the actual situation in the country is that view of the national issue. Support for the united and undivided Russia led the whites to lose terrible suffer terrible defeats. So the whites had to literally combat not just the Bolsheviks and the Reds, but also the nationalists. Petlura army, Ukrainian army, the Makhno army, and Makhno took Yekaterinoslav 2 times. He literally had one of the most efficient corps, Roman Slashov's regiment. He virtually paralyzed Denikin's troops in the process of in the event on Moscow. So there's a lot that we don't know about Red, Bonaparte, Trotsky, or Makhno, or indeed the very efficient activities of these people. And the taking of power in Petrograd in October of 1917 happened at the time when St. Petersburg had the largest garrison in Russia. And none of these troops went to stand guard for the provisional government. So three fronts in the Ukraine. There was a war against Georgia. There was one in Azerbaijan, in Estonia, the Red Mongols, Red Yakuts, Red Chinese, and finally, the Cossacks, who were extremely repelled or resented, not just by the North Caucasian peoples, but even the Russian peasants and the city dwellers. And the Cossacks were widely regarded as the police. And finally, it would certainly not be right to say that the white movement was liberal, not just because of the Cossacks, not because, but because of the anti-Semitic sentiment and anti-minority sentiment. And I shall just quote a slogan to show how much the ideas of anti-Semitism were used, and this image is quite transparent. This is something that we saw in the white movement. And Frank could have said that the Bolsheviks were the Black Hundreds, whereas the historical statistics show that the number of pogroms, of the Jewish pogroms during the war on the part of the White Army, about hundreds of thousands of dead. And on the part of the Reds, of course, there were massacres, of course, but the share of those killed because of the Reds was about 3 times lower than on the part of the Whites. And this was not an unconditional liberal movement. This was certainly based, predicated upon the imperial Black Hundred Force, which eventually prevailed. Not in 1921, not in 1922, but if you look at the establishment today, if you look at those who are erecting the monuments to General Denikin, those who are commissioning the film on Kolchak, those who are using the phobias, then you will eventually see that the followers of the Black Hundred idea are the relatives of Count Tolstoy, Milonov, and others, those who have already made special declarations, which you all know. So what I'm saying is that elitism is mainly and always creating precepts for populism. And I'm also talking about liberal self-critique, and that the liberals did not extract the lesson up until nowadays. Several vindications for my thesis. Most of liberally minded persons are in anticipation of crisis, an acute crisis which they view as the beginning of a democratic change. However, history knows a different course. And if we take the case of Bolshevik Russia or Nazi Germany, or else the 1979 in Iran, or indeed the movement from in the Ukraine from Yushchenko to Yanukovych, show that the revolutionary time is the worst time for the liberalism and for the liberals and the liberalism. And as it was said, we can see a lot of populist forces which come to the fore. The liberals are often arrogant and elitist today, talking about the Vatniks, the nation of the slaves. And by the way, I have taken some of these phrases from our liberal friends. Or the psychological heritage of the Golden Horde, and this horde beginnings do not allow the Russian people to embrace the liberal ideas. The devil is in the details, and as we know, the arrogance of the liberals is indeed extremely dangerous. And I have to say that even in the team of Yeltsin, this was present, and it is still present. The elitism of liberals, both historically and in today's world, is mostly based upon their certain resource limitations. Today, a country is at a stage when the material values, as you have rightly said, are indeed mostly expressed. And this factor needs to be taken into account. We have to deal with the people we have, and we have to have a certain preparation as to how to talk to our own people. We have talked about the Karamzin's tradition, and we have also said that these traditions must combine. I agree with this, and I agree that enlightenment is the clue. It is certainly important, and the civic importance of our trips and seminars is an attempt to try and introduce the element of enlightenment. But it is also clear that to avoid utopian thinking, we have to say that this is not sufficient. We also have some preliminary conditions. And in this sense, there may be a question directed to me. And how can we carry through the unpopular reforms? What can we do? Well, of course, I do not have any ready-made answer, but I do have an opinion, is that if you want to have unpopular reforms, you have to have some compensation. Historically, this has always been the case. The Baltic states had extremely unpopular reforms, but they had compensations. And the compensation was viewed as the building of a national nation state. Can this work in Russia? If Russia has been and continues to be a metropolia with a great imperial syndrome. And so the symbolical expansion is pretty much the only penchant. The number of people who are going to Crimea today are a lot less than those who could go to Crimea by train, and so on and so forth. So that means that we have to have some alternatives. And in this, I would like to immediately answer the question about Mr. Navalny. I regard him as a person who could well be among the first to take the liberal, of course I say it in parentheses, as anything related to the liberals in Russia, but he may be willing to take it out from the ghetto, from the very narrow circle of those who call themselves liberals, trying to bring those and showing the vices of the state. I can't call him a populist, probably not more than any other politician, because as I said, populism is a hypocritical notion. I don't think that he is a hypocrite, and I do not think that his critique of the establishment is quite sincere. That I would not say either. And this ability this ability to find the other and to talk to the other in these very low social resource conditions is something that Mr. Navalny demonstrates very conclusively. And every time when we have to think about the change, we also have to think about the resource or the social resource for change. And every time when we say that Mr. Trump got elected because of the rednecks who voted for him, then we will continue to generate Mr. Trumps, because we will continue to ask ourselves, and why weren't the elitists taking into account the moods of the people? My dear democratic friends in Russia, even 1 year before in the United States, were saying we don't want to vote for Mrs. Clinton. We don't want to vote for her. And unfortunately, the system in America is such that Mr. Macron cannot come out in the U.S. In the U.S. system. I spoke to Toby today, and we discussed it with respect to the Democratic Party, and apparently all social lifts are blocked. But if this elitism is not changed, then populism will come to supplant it. One should not be praising the liberals and vilifying the populists. There is no big deal about it. This is not rocket science, but this is a path in futility. It's an effort in futility, and it is a deadlock, because apparently this would only lead to marginalization of that very liberal camp that you wish to represent. So we just have to shed this coil of elitism. We have to give it up. I don't have recipes, I don't have formulas, but I have a viewpoint, and I'm sharing this viewpoint with you.